Well, a couple months ago, I preached the sermon that I originally wrote for today, the day that we dedicate the new bench commemorating the local Underground Railroad and anti-slavery efforts. But I decided to preach that sermon back in July because I found so much information I needed to spread it out. This month we are focusing on justice efforts. And today we get a look at the beginnings of this church, this time with a focus on the racial justice work of our first three pastors. There'll be some overlap with the July sermon to refresh our memories and put the church start and those pastors in context. More details are in the brochure that Charlotte put together. It's in your bulletins and also in recent Knox pages and Mount Vernon news articles, I'm happy to say. In 1834, a number of Christians in our nation were taking part in a protest movement, leaving church institutions that did not strongly oppose slavery. And 30 members in this town joined the movement. They left their church and they started this church on July 26, 1834. Later that year, as a part of the movement, 75 seminarians famously left Cincinnati's Lane Seminary, transferring to Oberlin. They became known as the Lane Rebels. Our first two pastors, Reverend Benjamin Higby and Reverend Edward Weed, were among the Lane Rebels. Our third pastor, Reverend Michael Strebe, was not a Lane Rebel, but he ended up being even more famous. At the start, our church actively opposed slavery. We were part of the Anti-Slavery Society. We led the way in hosting anti-slavery speakers and working on the Underground Railroad in Knox County. Those loving actions, seeking justice and loving kindness, were often met with violence. Mobs pelted the church with rocks and eggs and made loud noises to disrupt the anti-slavery speakers. Some of those speakers were actually chased out of town, threatened with violence. One was almost lynched. Our first pastor is listed on most records as Reverend P.W. Higby. His first name was actually Benjamin. Before he could sign the Lane Rebel protest documents in December of 1834, Benjamin appears to have arrived in Mount Vernon. There's not a lot of information specifically about him. But curiously, I came across a document indicating a Benjamin W. Higby was at law school in 1833 in Kentucky, 70 miles from Cincinnati, a year before the Lane Rebellion. And I don't know it was him, but for some reason, I like to think the church may have started off with a pastor with legal training. We do know that as our pastor, Benjamin became one of the first members of the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. We also know he invited the classmate who was a primary force between the walkout at Lane Seminary, Reverend W.T. Allen, to speak at our church. And it caused quite a ruckus. Reverend Allen was the speaker who was chased out of town and almost lynched. That violence didn't deter Benjamin or the founders of this church. They organized bodyguard and property guard systems to ensure the anti-slavery work continued. There's a succinct description of Benjamin hanging in our church hall. It's a description I am sure that Jesus is proud of. It tells us P.W. Higby was, quote, one of the students who left Lane Seminary in the exodus to Oberlin, medium in stature, strong in physique, energetic in body and mind, spiritual and evangelistic, 4 years of militant service, end quote. During his tenure here, Benjamin had a classmate, a friend, and Lane Rebel, Edward Weed, come to the church and preach in February of 1836. At the time, Edward was employed as a lecturing agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society, which is not too surprising, because while at Lane Seminary, Edward worked on the Underground Railroad, became a Lane Rebel, and was dedicated to abolition. His first sermon here as a guest preacher was on Psalm 68, verse 31. We heard Psalm 68 in the invocation in the King James Version that Edward knew. Verse 3 reads, "Princes shall come forth out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands unto God." That verse is known as the Ethiopian prophecy. Back then and up through to today, it's connected American slavery with the slavery of the Hebrews in Egypt and their emancipation struggle. After his Psalm 68 sermon, Edward wrote to his wife how pleased he was with our congregation's response, noting our predecessors are an excellent people, full of faith and good works, and nearly all abolitionists. After guest preaching here, Edward returned to work promoting anti-slavery in lectures all around the state of Ohio. He bravely faced mobs and serious threats of violence. In fact, a few months after he preached here, he wrote his wife noting, "There are men thirsting for my blood and would kill me if they had a good opportunity as soon as they would shake a snake." Edward noted he'd been in the midst of an infuriated mob who were seeking his life. And he wasn't exaggerating. A mob in Waverly, Ohio was talked out of killing him, chased him out of town. And to spite him, and to hurt his relatives, the anti-abolitionists were, as Edward put it in another letter to his wife, quote, "getting up reports that I have been inhumanely beaten or murdered to harass my friends," end quote. Those rumors spread across the nation and were reported in the Boston Courier and Washington Globe. And while they were not true, believe it or not, Edward's anti-slavery work that summer directly led to what's called the Battle of Holton's Mill, where abolitionists clashed with anti-abolitionists in Pike County, Ohio, leaving one man dead. That same summer, Edward's anti-slavery work caused the Piketon City Council to pass the now notorious Piketon Anti-Abolition Resolution, which opposed abolition and banned abolitionists from visiting their county, threatening, if there was such a visit, we will not hold ourselves accountable for the consequences. In 1838, Edward, probably worn out from all of that violence, understandably decided to look for other work. And thankfully, he was invited to become this church's second pastor. During his tenure, he continued the anti-slavery and racial justice work that the founders of the church and Benjamin Higbee had begun. And in 1842, our third pastor, Reverend Michael Strebe, came on board, and he also continued the work of our church founders and Benjamin and Edward. And we know that Michael and the church continued the anti-slavery and racial justice work because our church records have a rare written recording of work on the Underground Railroad. Records indicate our early church family found a way to take advantage of mob disturbances. Michael reported that one night in 1842, while a mob was busy disrupting an anti-slavery meeting in our church, John Scribner, a 12-year-old from the church, drove a wagon from the Utica area on the Freedom Trail to Mount Vernon with 19 escaped slaves on board, who were then taken by church member D.L. Travis to safety further north. Pastor Michael stayed here 12 years, 1842 to 1854. And while he was here, he was appointed to Oberlin's Board of Trustees. And that led to him eventually working with the American Missionary Association, a Protestant-based abolitionist group involved in efforts to abolish slavery, but also involved in efforts for the education of African Americans and in continuing efforts for racial equality. Michael was appointed the head of that missionary association at a critical time in 1860, a post he held for 30 years. His work lasted so long and was so extensive and effective that there are churches and roads and college buildings still named after him. These three men, our first pastors, Reverend Benjamin Higbee, Reverend Edward Weed, and Reverend Michael Strebe, and the congregations that worked with them and supported their work, were instrumental in the anti-slavery work and Underground Railroad efforts in this area. And they created the deep and lasting roots this church has always had in racial justice work. They followed God's instruction from Micah 6 to seek justice, to love kindness. They followed Jesus' teaching to love everyone and treat those in need as they would treat Christ, because Christ is in them. And they followed Paul's teaching toward equality and equity, summed up well in our lesson from Galatians. There's no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Thank God for the blessings of those pastors, of our early church founders, and all of our anti-slavery friends. May this church always continue the racial justice work they began. May we seek justice and love kindness